right, let's introduce our keynote speaker. Paul is Vice President of Impact Investing and Ecosystem Services for the World Wildlife Fund. He has a background in operating shellfish and commercial kelp farms. He has served on advisory boards for NOAA, Conservation Law Foundation, among others, and he serves as a delegate to the International Council for the Exploration of the Sea. This is a regional fishing advisory board and one of the oldest intergovernmental science organizations in the world. So without further ado, would you let's give a warm welcome to Paul Dobbins.
Thank you. I'm going to try this without a microphone first. I wear hearing aids, so I'm very sensitive to not being able to hear. But I'm going to see if I can project to the back of the room. So can you hear me back there? Nah, okay. All right, I'll use the microphone. Hopefully, I sometimes speak with my hands, it won't end up in the pond. Okay. As Mike introduced me, I'm Paul Dobbins. I'm Vice President of Aquaculture and Director of Impact Investing at the World Wildlife Fund. The World Wildlife Fund is one of our oldest conservation organizations. We work in 100 countries around the world, and our mission is to have humans and nature live in harmony. I sit in the food group at World Wildlife Fund, despite the fact that I work in the ocean. And the reason I sit there is that food has the largest impact on our climate. Whether it be through greenhouse gas emissions, land conversion, which we're really concerned about. We convert land for agriculture at the rate of 2 Germanys per year. And if you think of how much space is left on our Earth, we can't do that in deserts. We shouldn't do that in the Amazon. We can't do it in the Himalayas. There aren't that many Germanys left. And so we're concerned about how are we going to feed an ever-growing population with food systems that are sustainable and resilient and have less impact on our Earth. Fortunately, we have the ocean, and in the ocean, we can grow lots of food. I love this quote from Jacques Cousteau. This was from an interview he did in 1973, and he's really the first person that popularized conservation in the ocean. And yet he was saying we must plant the sea and herd its animals. And he did this in the context of how are we going to feed our growing population as we run out of land. See if we can get this one. And so we have an objective in our group of advancing seaweed and shellfish farming for societal and climate gains. Today I'm going to talk about seaweed, and we're going to talk a little bit about why seaweed is important to WWF and to improving the climate. And then we're going to talk about how we actually farm it. I had no idea that you could farm seaweed. I always thought of seaweed as the stuff that washes up on the beach that we're not happy with in August, or wraps around the leg when you're a little kid and you get all nervous about it. It actually is really important to our society in ways that we probably don't think about. So I have a question. How many of you consume seaweed today? Yeah, good portion, good portion. How many brush their teeth? Fortunately, everyone. This is a close room. It's estimated that the average American touches seaweed 5 times a day. We have it in our toothpaste as a thickener when we brush our teeth in the morning and in the evening. If we go out to McDonald's and we have a milkshake, it's there. If we have ice cream for dessert, it's there. If we have processed foods, it's in there. These are extracts from seaweed called carrageenan and alginates that are thickeners for many of our processed foods and for our health products. And so why is a conservation organization advocating for more human activity in the ocean in the form of farming? That's a not uncontroversial position to take. So seaweed farming requires no arable land, no fresh water, fertilizers, or pesticides. As the seaweed grows, it absorbs carbon dioxide, phosphorus, and nitrogen. Three things we have too much of in many of our bays and estuaries. And it gives off oxygen as it performs photosynthesis. And all of this provides a highly nutritious food for humans and animals and a feedstock for industrial processes, and creates jobs in coastal communities. And I love this graph from Scott Lindell, a friend of mine over at Woods Hole. He used this in a TED Talk, and I asked him if I could borrow it because it illustrates so clearly why the ocean may be the future of food production for generations to come. Everything above the blue line is grown in a marine environment. Everything below the blue line is grown on land. And you can see a dramatic difference in the resource use per ton of edible protein. That's principally because the top two, seaweed and shellfish, are non-fed species, meaning that we don't have to provide feed for them. They get it from the phytoplankton and from the chemistry of the ocean. Down here, what do you notice that's different about the animals down there to the animals and the plants that are up there?
Freshwater use, land use.
Right. Look at just the pictures though.
Size.
They're bigger.
Bigger. They have legs too. And those legs require a lot of energy to grow and to operate. The difference between a marine food system and a terrestrial food system, particularly for protein production, is that these folks up here don't have to fight gravity. And so their feed conversion ratio, or their resource conversion ratio, is much more efficient than land-based agriculture. And what we're finding out, the researchers are finding out, that the top two that are circled there, when used to provide feed to the bottom, actually make these food production systems much more efficient. And research is suggesting also that this greenhouse gas emissions, everyone thinks that, you know, when the cow toots, we have methane in here. It actually is when they burp. Research is suggesting that seaweeds fed to cows reduce that methane production from the cows and improve their feed conversion. So there may be a way for these food production systems that happen in a marine environment to actually improve the efficiency of food production systems in the terrestrial environment. So what is it going to take for seaweed, of all things, to make a significant contribution and a meaningful contribution to our climate change? This graph right here illustrates the global seaweed harvest in million metric tons from about the 50s until now. The light green is the wild harvest of seaweed. So for eons, societies have been harvesting seaweed as a means of providing green vegetable nutrition in times when it wasn't available to them, say in the winter here, and using it for other industrial purposes. And in about 1970, 98% of the seaweed harvested in the world was wild harvested. And if not done right, that can do significant damage to the wild seaweed beds that are critically important as nurseries, as providers of oxygen, as remediators of excess nutrients in the water. And 2% was farmed. Believe it or not, an industrial activity is actually an amazing success story for the ocean. Because today, 98% of the seaweed is farmed, and only 2% is wild harvested. And if seaweed keeps growing, this farmed seaweed green section here, at the rate it's currently growing, it will surpass potatoes in our children's lifetime. 2051, it's estimated to surpass potatoes as the fourth largest cultivated crop on Earth. And that's kind of amazing for us to think about, sitting here next to the Atlantic, because we haven't been exposed to it. But if you go to China, or Japan, or Korea, or Indonesia, or Malaysia, or the Philippines, you'll understand how that can happen, because those societies produce 98% of the seaweed that's farmed. Madagascar, another 0.5%, Tanzania, 1%, and then 40 other countries, the US included, produce only 0.5% of our global harvest. So what is seaweed? Seaweed is a macroalgae. It's a kind of a catch-all term for a family of plant-like organisms that are in 3 kingdoms, and I'm not gonna go through the kingdoms. Phylum, yeah, exactly, King Philip, that would be. But for us lay people, it's easy to put it into 3 groups: the reds, the greens, and the browns. Right? And that's actually how scientists talk about them as well, because it's so confusing. And all of these seaweeds that you see here can be found right in this river. So this is dulse, this is sea lettuce, we see this washing up on the beach. And this brown one here is called sugar kelp. And today I'm going to talk about the kelps. They're the brown family of seaweeds, and they're typically the largest seaweeds that you'll find in the ocean. And so this is a picture of a seaweed from Korea that was grown on a farm. This is seaweed called Laminaria japonicus, and it's very similar to the sugar kelp that grows right over there in the river. However, this grows up to 24 feet long, and it's about 4 feet wide, and it's about this thick. So, how do you farm seaweed? This is the tip of a sugar kelp seaweed. So sugar kelp grows from about New York Harbor up under the ice cap, just under the ice cap on the East Coast. And it grows over in Europe, and it also grows in Alaska. It's ubiquitous in our sphere. At the very end of it, if you find one on the beach and you pick it up, the opaque surface right here will be a little bit raised. This raised surface are tubes that radiate out from the center of the kelp. These tubes are called sporangia, and they contain spores. Kelp reproduces like a mushroom with spores. If we take that dark area and we cut it out and we stress it, we can get those spores to release. So in nature, when an organism is stressed or challenged, it can either fight, it can flee, or it can reproduce. Seaweed can't fight or flee. So what it does when it's stressed is it reproduces. So what we do is we dry it out a little and we heat it up a little. And so it wants to reproduce. And then we take it and we put it in a beaker filled with seawater. So these are the little pieces here. And we wait a couple minutes. And that beaker is suddenly filled with billions and billions of spores. And we can do this for your education class. We do this with 5th grade classes. They become seaweed farmers. You can do this on a windowsill. It's if you find a piece of seaweed down on the beach, take that middle part, that sorus tissue, let it warm up a little, put it in a glass of seawater, and you'll see this happen right before your eyes. And if you have a microscope, let me see if I can do this without my glasses on. There you go. These are the spores that are swimming around on this hemocytometer. This is a means of measuring their size. When I first saw this, I was amazed. This is similar to seeing an acorn fall out of a tree, sprout legs when it hits the ground, run down the street and plant itself. Right? Because we think of seaweed as a plant. And yet these are traveling around under their own power. They have 2 flagella, and what they're trying to do is escape the light. They can sense the light. The reason they're trying to escape the light is at the surface, and they only have 24 hours of power before they find something to attach themselves with. And then once they attach themselves, they can begin the next phase of their life. To give you an idea of the size, these are about 1/10 of the diameter of our hair. Well, your hair, I don't know. And some of these are swimming quite nicely. Some of them are not swimming at all. They didn't make it. And some of them are swimming in circles, and that tells us that one of the flagella is damaged. So they're kind of just circling around. As seaweed farmers, what we're trying to do is estimate in a milliliter of water, because that's what you put on this, how many of those spores are in there. Because just like terrestrial farmers, we have to worry about stocking density. We don't want to put too many seeds in the ground, because then we won't get the yield that we need out of the farm. And then once we have those spores, what we do is we put them into tanks. And I'm going to get a prop here. And in those tanks, and you can see there's light at the top, because we want those spores to swim down. And we want them to attach themselves to this string. Basically, it's kite string. And the kite string, we'll put this here, is going to be wrapped around this tube. And this is where the magic happens. This is where we move from zoospore into seaweed, right on this string. So these tubes are in these tanks. That's James, he's the nursery manager. And this is these are chillers. Seaweed loves to be at 50 degrees. That's its perfect temperature. So we make that perfect temperature happen. And if we were to look at that seaweed after 24 hours of attaching, it started to form what are called gametophytes. And I'm gonna walk over here just so that I can point, so everyone can see. This scrawny looking guy is a male gametophyte. Remember, we're thinking of these things as plants, but right now they're acting very much like animals. And this rather robust looking creature is the female. The egg is right there. And the sperm is right there. They reproduce, and after they reproduce, within a couple of days, you have a baby kelp plant. This has about 9 cells in it. And the fluffy stuff you see is this string, to give you an idea of its size, under the microscope. After about 30 days, it's ready to leave the nursery and go out into the open ocean. And it gets put on a rope. It looks like this is actually one of the ropes that's used. And the rope is lowered 7 feet under the water, because we found that that's about the ideal depth for them to be, so they get the right amount of light. And then the ropes are attached to moorings, and they're held up by buoys. And these ropes are about 1,000 to 1,000 feet long. And then we wait, just like land farmers. And if you look at this, this looks very similar to terrestrial farming. You have rows. And if you look at it from above, back when this was taken, drones didn't exist really, we would look down and it would look just like a farmer's field. And after a couple weeks in the water, it looks like this. And after about 4 weeks in the water, it looks like that. It grows very rapidly. There are species of seaweed, the giant kelp off of the coast of California, that grow so fast you can actually watch it with your eyes, even if you blink. They grow 3 feet a day, and if you do the math, you can go down, and you can watch this stuff grow. It grows so fast. And as it's growing, it creates structure and habitat for other organisms. In this farm right here, we see pollet coming in and congregating at the farm in the winter. And seaweed farming in the high latitudes happens in the winter. You create your seed in September, you put it out in October and November, and then you start harvesting. This is the week that seaweed farmers in Maine will start harvesting their crop. It's a low light organism. It's evolved to be that way, this particular kelps. And the reason they're brown is to keep the chloroplasts from getting blown out in the summer. It's just like our suntan lotion. It helps protect the internals of the plant. This is another video. One of the advantages of seaweed farming and why it's so productive. Typically it will produce 2 to 3 times as much biomass as a farm field. Is because think of broccoli. Broccoli uses about 18 inches going up into the sky and about 6 inches going down into the soil for an acre. If you think about an acre of seaweed farm, they can go down 40 feet. This is a seaweed farm located in the Faroes, and it's farming sugar kelp, the same seaweed that we have out there. So it's true 3D farming, and it's a really efficient use of space. The entire farm seaweed industry takes up 2,000 square kilometers in the ocean, which seems like a lot to us, but that generates 36 million metric tons of food and biomass. NOAA has estimated that just the state of Alaska alone has 90,000 square kilometers that are appropriate for seaweed farming and not used for fishing and other existing uses that have the appropriate nutrients. So there's a significant opportunity to expand this industry outside of the Western Pacific. And so about 90 days after putting those little zoospores, right, into these tubes and letting them to attach to this, we have this level of biomass here. It's truly remarkable. No fresh water, no arable land, no fertilizers, and no pesticides. The other remarkable thing about this industry that I didn't know when I got involved in it, it is the only ocean-facing industry that's woman-dominated. And we were in International Women's Day yesterday.
Yeah.
There are over 5 million women that participate in this industry. They're CEOs of processing facilities, they're farmers, they're researchers, they're deckhands, they're tender hands, they're advocates, they're product developers. It's really remarkable. I am really in the majority as a male in this industry, and it's truly remarkable that no matter what coast you're on, whether you're in Indonesia, the Philippines, Maine, Iceland, Norway, South Africa, it's the same story. This is Karen Cooper. Karen was the first commercial fisherman, and she wants to be known as a fisherman, to farm seaweed in North America. And this is about 14 years ago, and she's smiling because that's her first crop coming in. She's been farming ever since. There was a lot of opposition to her farming at the time when she went in. What we've seen now is that there are fishing families up and down the coast that are taking advantage of this opportunity to earn income in the winter. So this is Colleen Frankie. She's originally from Cape Cod, and her husband Brent Nappy. They fish out of where we raised our children, up in Falmouth, Maine. And Brent fishes offshore in the winter for lobster, and Colleen farms seaweed, because she thinks they're crazy to go offshore in the winter. She'd rather stay. But the actual reason that Colleen farms seaweed is she wants to work on the water, and lobstering is a closed fishery in Maine. And the current wait in her zone is 21 years. And she doesn't want to wait 21 years to work on the water. This works out perfect for her. So, who are some of these women? The woman on in the black and white photo is Mary Drew. And Mary Drew is a remarkable character in history. She got her PhD from the University of Manchester in psychology, the study of seaweed. And then in 1928, she fell in love and got married to Henry Baker. And the University of Manchester, where she was teaching and doing research at the time, had a policy that married women couldn't be employed. And so she had to leave the university. But she persisted, and she kept her research going. And she studied a seaweed called porphyra. And porphyra is more commonly known as nori. And nori is what you get around your sushi wraps. And it's incredibly important to Japanese food security and to their culture. And the challenge in Japan at the time was it was wild harvested, and the harvests were very uneven. And so it created a food security problem for the Japanese, because they're a mountainous country that has difficulty feeding their population with just what they can grow on land. So seaweed's incredibly important to them. Mary, after she was dismissed, figured out how to close the loop, or the life cycle, for nori, which is a red seaweed, and red seaweeds are incredibly difficult to figure that out. In a sense, in layman's terms, she figured out how to make the seed. And by figuring out how to make the seed, the Japanese were then able to start to cultivate this particular seaweed that they never did. And through cultivation, just like when we go out and we forage for blueberries or raspberries, it's up and down. We have a good year or a bad year. When you go into cultivation, you have more control, and they're able to generate more and more consistently. She's honored in Japan as the mother of the ocean. There's a shrine to her, and on April 14th this year, the country will celebrate her achievements. They do it every year, and they'll continue to do it. She's revered in Japan because they realize that their industry would not exist without her efforts. She's actually never been to Japan. But she has a shrine there, and they have a festival to her name. I don't know the name of this woman. This was in WWF's photo archive. But I do know that she's in Malaysia, and she's farming seaweed. And in her country, the men go out to sea, and they fish, and that's considered not the purview of women. They're not allowed to go to sea. And so many of the women, about 1.5 million women, they farm seaweed. What the men won't tell you is the women make more money farming seaweed than fishing, but they don't talk about that much. But that's the case. They contribute significantly to the income of not only the nation, but their families. And then this young woman actually works on our team. Her name is Bailey Moritz, and she has the world's first masters in ocean food production systems. And what she's holding up, and you can see the diversity here, this is the seaweed that's used to make the thickeners in your toothpaste and in our milkshakes. These two seaweeds have not been cultivated yet, but most likely will, and they're up in Alaska. And here we have what's called 5-ribbon kelp, and over here we have what's called dragon kelp. These are huge organisms and can grow a significant amount of biomass in a small area. So we think of eating seaweed in a seaweed salad, we think of eating it in sushi. Animals also think about eating seaweed. So this is a sheep at low tide in the Faroe Islands that has gone down, and it's hard to see, but there are actually 3 different families of seaweed on this stretch of rock. And it's specifically picked out the sugar kelp to eat. The animals go down to the shore to eat the seaweed to get the micronutrients that they're not getting in their forage or feed. And it's not just in the Faroes. If we go out to the Elizabeth Islands out there, we can see steer coming down at low tide and eating the sugar kelp that they see there. What's interesting is the animals will sometimes eat the sugar kelp, and sometimes eat the sea lettuce, and sometimes eat the dulse. The different types of seaweed have different nutritional profiles, and scientists don't understand how the animals know what to eat, but they know what to eat, and they come down to the shore. Just like indigenous peoples who have lived on the shore have done for eons, they pick the seaweeds that are really important for the nutritional profile that they have to supplement their diet. And this is a particularly interesting area for production of seaweed in new markets. As I mentioned earlier, they may be able to help terrestrial farming become more efficient, and a lot of the land conversion that's happening today is to grow soybean to feed to livestock. If we can slow some of that down by substituting in seaweed, the animals not only become healthier through a healthier gut, better feed conversion, etc., they also are taking the pressure off of land conversion to create their feed. And farmers all over the world know this. These are ranchers from Tasmania, and they're sending their cows down to the beach to eat the mung. So if you've been to Cherry Mud Beach in August, you know what mung is, right? That's the sea felt, is the common name that's washing up on our shore. And the same kind of thing happens on a lot of coast, and this is happening in Tanzania. And the farmers will drive, or the ranchers will drive their steer down there because they know that it's great nutrition for the cows. And it's quite an amazing thing to see a cow wading around in the ocean. Maybe we'll see that someday during the web, and that'll take care of our mung problem.
At Allen's Pond, you see it.
Yeah, you do. Wonderful. And it's not just cows. So we funded some research that enabled some seaweed that was grown in the Faroe Islands, that sits between Norway and Iceland, to be transported to Denmark, fermented, and used as animal feed for swine. And then we replicated this study in Sioux City, South Dakota. And what they found is that the sows on a 3,000 sow farm had a 15% improvement in feed conversion ratio, a 51% reduction in antibiotic use. Animals, the animals that we eat, use over half of the antibiotics that are produced in the world. So it's not our kids going to the doctor all the time saying using the antibiotics. It's really animals. So we saw a 51% reduction in antibiotic use. The sows produced one more piglet per reproductive cycle. And of those piglets, there was a 5% drop in mortality. Principally all of this is just due to better gut health that's brought along by the seaweed. So this research still needs to be done, but there could be a significant impact on our terrestrial farming. and our antibiotic use, if this gets adopted, if the research continues to pan out. In the 1930s, in the UK, if you were using cellophane, that cellophane was made with seaweed. And a seaweed that grows right out here on our rocks called ascophyllum or rockweed. And then World War II came along, and after World War II, oil became incredibly cheap. And the plastics that were developed out of oil were far more versatile. And so we lost the technology of making plastics from seaweed. There are companies in the UK right now, and in the US, and in Asia that are racing to develop this technology anew, because these plastics are home compostable. If they end up in the ocean, they won't break down into microplastics. They'll just dissolve. And a byproduct of that process is ink. And I didn't realize this, but ink has petroleum products in it. And the latest data I could find was only from 1987, and we may use a lot less ink because of the internet now. But in 1987, the US used 93 million gallons of oil for ink and 97 million pounds of resins made from oil for ink. I had no idea that ink had so much plastic in it. So if you think of all the cardboard that gets blown out into the ocean, if we could have ink made from seaweed on that, that's a byproduct, we would do much better for the ocean, and much less microplastics would go in there. We're learning that textiles can be made from seaweed. This picture over there is not what we're gonna wear. Fortunately, this was done by, I can't remember the name, but a very famous Korean designer for the International Seaweed Symposium, which happens every 3 years. All the researchers get together. And we went out to a farm and grabbed some seaweed, and then live on a stage, the designer created this. But this is fiber that was made by a two-woman company, again, back to women, located in Portland, Maine, called Viable Gear. And Katie Weiler, a young woman who grew up in the fisheries and realizes how much plastic we use in the fisheries, is trying to develop twines that can be used in the fisheries that come from seaweed. And she's really kind of moving right along. I think she may have something here. And there are also companies now that are making seaweed-based fibers that can be used in our clothes. So if you think of the impact cotton has on our environment, particularly our water usage, it's dramatic. If we could supplant 10–15% of the cotton usage with this, then that's an environmental win. So that wraps up the presentation. I want to acknowledge our funders. So we can't do this work globally without our funders. So I'd like to acknowledge the Gates Foundation, the Grantham Family Foundation, the two of the Walmart Foundations, the Builders Initiative and the Builders Vision, and the Riley Family Foundation. These groups have come together. They've recognized seaweed as one of the great neglected climate opportunities out there. And they're enabling us to do the fundamental work to take what is a very mature and old industry in Asia. The oldest continuously operating seaweed farm is 351 years old this year. It's in Tokyo Bay. And bring it to this hemisphere, where the oldest continuously operating seaweed farm is 16 years old. It just barely dry. Right? But we have the longest coastlines in the world, in Norway, Canada, in the US, with the most nutrient-dense waters in the world. And we have a highly educated, highly equipped fishing community up and down all of these coasts that are looking for fill-ins for income in the winter. There are 170 families that are farming seaweed in Maine now, and 8 of those families last year, and these are the highliners, produced more income and profit from farming than they did fishing. Fishing is tough out there right now, and so they're looking for alternatives to continue the way of life that for generations has existed in their communities. And this is one highlight. He said, look, this isn't any different than what we do. We go out into the ocean, we extract value, we bring it back, and we sell it at the dock. And we love what we do, and we want to continue doing it. And so this may be an opportunity not only to have impact in our climate, but also to continue allowing our working waterfronts to keep going when they're under tremendous pressure, and continue that way of life that we all admire so much. So with that, we'll take some questions.
If you have a question, once you raise your hand, and we'll get, maybe Paul, if you could repeat the question. in case
Yeah.
people don't have-
Yeah, and
Rhea?
Monterey Bay is known for its kelp forest.
yes,
Can you enlighten us about that?
yes, so the kelp that's grown on Monterey Bay and along the California coast is called giant kelp or macrocystis, and that's the one that grows 3 feet a day. Unfortunately, those kelp beds are under significant pressure and they're diminishing rapidly. Scientists don't know exactly why, but they believe a significant contributor is with climate change and the changing of the ocean temperature. The same thing is happening here. The sugar kelp that this polar bear is eating, because it's found right up to the ice cap, its natural range used to be New York Harbor to the ice cap here on the East Coast. Was at a presentation of scientists a couple weeks ago in Maine, and they now believe that the natural, real healthy natural range is from Muscungus Bay in Maine. So if you think of Maine, it goes Saco, Casco, Muscungus, up to the ice cap. And that change has only taken place in the last 30 years. And the reason being is the thermal threshold for this seaweed is 67 degrees. Once the temperature goes above 67 degrees, the seaweed can't survive anymore. And so what we're having with these ocean heat waves is, and the changing ocean temperatures, is that dynamic range, or the range of that seaweed is moving north rather rapidly. So they think that that might be one of the reasons that the macrocystis beds are going away. Fortunately, we have farmers. Farmers know how to make seed, and there are restoration efforts that are starting to spring up around the world, where they're taking the seed and they're strain selecting for temperature tolerance. We're actually funding some of that work over at Woods Hole for the seaweeds here on the East Coast, because the scientists know that if we don't do that, we're gonna lose the biodiversity we have because of that changing temperature.
Is there widespread use of seaweed in vitamins and medicines and also medical treatment?
So the question is there widespread use of seaweed in vitamins and medicines and medical treatment? Yes, not necessarily in this country. However, many native communities in this country understand the medicinal benefits of seaweed. Just like we have medicinal benefits of plants in the forests and in the fields, the same thing happens with seaweed, particularly around antimicrobial benefits. We had a Native American working in our seaweed processing facility, and he had a bike accident, and he came in one day. His name was Jeff Boone. And he had his head wrapped in seaweed, kind of like that picture of the Spirit of '76 with the fight from the drum. And I'm like, Jeff, what are you doing? And he said, oh, my grandmother told me to do this. And so, right, so generations down. And that actually, researchers are understanding that the seaweed's biome, the chemical composition of the material that's being sloughed off of the seaweed, actually has antimicrobial properties in it. And the reason being is that's one of the seaweed's defenses. You can't run or flee. And so there is use on that. Also, in diet, they're finding that the seaweed the fiber in seaweed, some seaweeds, can reduce some of the, I'm not a doctor, but it's better to have fiber from seaweed in a Twinkie than terrestrial fiber. Because it's gonna be better for you. This is the best way. And then studies in Japan on breast cancer. They studied 3,000 RNs in Japan. And they found, and then other countries, and they found that the RNs in Japan had significantly less incidence of breast cancer. They don't know the causality yet, but the correlation they're making is they eat seaweed 3 times a day. And there may be something there. So early days in the science, but Native American communities have been using it for medicinal purposes for eons.
It seems hard to get seaweed to eat. I'm going to correlate it with the eating. So when you go to you buy sushi, you can get a little thing of seaweed with it. But we don't tend to see it in the grocery stores, or maybe I'm missing it. you speak to the availability of eating?
Sure. In our culture, we moved away from consuming seaweed, and I'll use my great-grandmother Clemens as an example. She grew up on a farm in Nova Scotia, and her mother would go down to the shore, and I learned this from my grandmother, and grab the seaweed off the rocks and put it in the stew in the winter, and that's how they got the green nutrition, because there wasn't modern ways of preserving food. And my grandmother it was really cute. She said, and this also helped keep us sociable on the bean dinner. What she was talking about was the cow thing, right? And so we don't have as much availability here because once Clarence Birdseye came along up in Gloucester and we had frozen peas, and sure, great-grandma Clemens said the heck with going down in the ocean in the winter and grabbing seaweed, we're eating the peas. And so we've lost it in our culture. It's far more prevalent in Europe. They didn't lose it as much. For sure in Asia, in many Asian countries, you're eating it 3 times a day. But we do have it here. It just needs to be, you need to kind of look hard for it. And then I'll get to you, Betty, yes.
So do marine animals eat seaweed? Is that something that farmers have to manage, control?
So, great question. And as a farmer, we were at first worried about that. Do animals in the ocean eat seaweed? The answer is depends on where you are. So if you're out in Hawaii, in the middle latitudes, there's a family of fish called rudderfish. And if you're out in Hawaii, there's a species out there that's herbaceous, and they eat the seaweed there. And we funded some research that enabled the farmers to close the life cycle of the fish so that they could create more fish, and close the life cycle of the seaweed. And they grow them side by side. And so they grow the seaweed and they just throw it over and have the fish eat it. In Asia and in Europe, abalone farms. So abalone is a snail with a shell, and they eat seaweed. And if you go to Korea, what you'll find is the seaweed farms are right next to the abalone farms. And the seaweed farmers pick the seaweed up with cranes from their farm. They go like this, and they put it in the abalone bins, and that's their market for it. Up here in New England, what we worry about are urchins. Urchins will eat kelps, but if you're farming, you're up off the bottom and it's very difficult to get in there. Sometimes you'll find little baby urchins because the larva has made it into the seaweed farms. I'm ready.
Yeah, so manatees in Florida, right, they feed on seaweed, and their habitat is being destroyed by many reasons. Is there a way to implement like farming that would be both commercially viable and also help the manatees survive? Or are there studies about it?
Maria, you have to come work for us. There isn't right now. There really is no farming going on from about the Shinnecook people are farming on Long Island. That's about as far south as it goes right now. And then the next time you pick up farming is Puerto Rico. But there's nothing in the middle, so that would really be an interesting thing to study.
Nice. Are there invasive species to worry about? Do it impact?
Interesting you bring that up. I look over in the river, and we talked about Mary Baker and Porphyra or nori. In our river is a genetically distinct strain of nori. Where did it come from? So there's nori up and down this coast, but they're all pretty much the same genetically. And in 1999, Dr. Charles Yaris, a phycologist from the University of Connecticut, went out to our river and started studying the nori in there. And it's a genetically distinct strain. It may be an invasive from Japan. Now that we have genetic tools, Charlie is retired and no one's picked up on it, but now that we have genetic tools, there may be a way to trace that back to a boat that came from Asia, ended up in our port, or maybe that strain ended up somewhere else and a boat from our port picked it up, but then ended up here. And so there are invasives. One of the species that's looked at that reduces methane, enteric methane production in ruminants and cows is called Asparagopsis taxiformis. And everyone got excited several years ago that, hey, maybe this is the solution. It's also one of the 100 most invasive species in the world. And so we're not supporting that, because if it becomes economically viable, people will take that and start farming it, and it destroys coral beds. And we have coral reefs here. There's coral reefs in the Gulf of Maine. They're just deep and they don't look as wonderful as the ones we see in the Caribbean and the Great Barrier Reef. But there's real concern about that. Okay, Betty, you've been waiting patiently.
So, a group of us is transcribing Henry Smith's journal from the 1850s and 60s. And I keep seeing in there that he goes down to the river and he brings home a load of muck. And he does that very, very often. And he says, he also puts it up on the hills and he brings it home. Is that muck, do you think, by any chance, seaweed?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
It was not uncommon for farmers to do that. In Ireland, there are entire islands off the coast of Ireland that were made by farmers doing just that. So they were rocks, and what they did was they just kept piling the seaweed up for hundreds of years, and they became islands that they could then graze their sheep on. Ironically enough, in the Aran Islands, there's a whole group of sheep that eat nothing but seaweed. So the farmers went all through this effort of making the islands, and the sheep said the heck with that, and they're out there eating the seaweed. That's the only thing they eat. They don't even eat the grass on the islands. But your guess is probably correct.
It was called muck.
Yeah. Well,
Yes,
and
I
the,
can understand that.
and the seaweeds that wash up on our beach in the summer are called mung. So there's a very likely chance that they're one and the same.
The pictures of the seaweed on the ropes look very similar to what grows on my mooring. But when I pull up the mooring and try to get this stuff off, there's such a multitude of different kinds of seaweed and stuff that looks like brains, and there's also
Yum.
crabs and
Yeah.
other worms and other stuff. So how do they harvest this stuff so they don't have a mixture of all that stuff?
So the question is, how do farmers keep everything else? Because, you know, for anyone who has a mooring or a boat, right? Nature loves a brand new surface in the ocean. Everything grows on it. And so how do farmers keep that from happening? In our high latitudes, whether you're south or north, we're farming in the winter when much of the ocean is dormant. And so there's less chance that things are going to get in there. The farmers are also farming about 7 feet below the surface in maybe 60 feet of water. And so those horizontal lines that are growing across, and they're so seeded with seaweed that the seaweed outcompetes most things that are growing on it. Occasionally you'll get that little tiny urchin in there. Sometimes you get little crabs. The roots of seaweed aren't where they get nutrition. They take it up through their blade, but they're called holdfasts. And sometimes you'll see baby clams in there and baby a spat of mussels because it grows in there, but we don't harvest the roots. It gets cut off at the stem. And so it's not really a problem. One problem is lumpfish, like seaweed. And they love to live in seaweed. They're the cute little fish, and sometimes they'll come up with the seaweed, and you have to take them out and throw them back.
Maybe one more question?
I have a question. So, it seems, I mean, I know it's probably like a newer kind of thing, but it seems so beneficial to every party. Why do you think it's not like taken off to be everywhere yet?
She's not a plant. That's the perfect question. I'll be brief because we have to move on. That's what we do in our work, is to try and figure out how to advance it. And there are 2 major barriers in this hemisphere. The first is markets. We saw that graph, how fast it's growing, and that's from Asia. If we're going to put a lot more seaweed into the markets, we need opportunities like feed, alternatives to petroleum-based products, proteins, extracts, things like that, biostimulants that help terrestrial farmers become more efficient. So that's one challenge. The other challenge is that the oceans equal emotions, right? We all love the ocean, we're passionate about it. We don't, as a species, like change. And so there's what the academics call the social license to operate, or as lay people would call the public acceptance challenge. It's very difficult. And when we were farming in Maine, permits can take 3 to 5 years to get. And we had one young woman who wanted to farm oysters like carrion. And she put in her permit when she graduated from college. She fell in love, got married, had a child, and 5 years later was denied the permit. It's very, very difficult. Offshore permits can cost $500,000 to $750,000 just to do the environmental study. There used to be a lot of opposition from the fishing community, but now the fishing community are farming. And there's actually about 100 fishing family wait list in Maine to go through that 3 to 5 year process to get permitted. That's not unique to our coast. There are other coasts around the world where that's the same challenge because the oceans are busy. Defense, transportation, logistics for products, environmentally sensitive areas, fishing, recreation. We think of the ocean as this empty, benign place, but if you start to overlay those maps, it's actually incredibly busy out there. And then trying to get people to, it used to be the fishermen didn't want to see the change in Maine. Now they want it. The people that don't want to see the change are the riparian landowners, and they have a say in the process. Because we farm in the commons, we sit in the commonwealth. That's our commonwealth out there. And so there has to be a rigorous process to determine how we're going to use that as a society. All right, thank you.